Hello, my name is Alex, and I am pleased to be the moderator today for our panel, Knife in Our Hands, Reclaiming Queerness and Monstrosity in Horror. I'm speaking to you today from the native lands of the Tongva people, and therefore would also like to direct you to www.gabrielano-nsn.us for more ways to support the Indigenous community of the area that I'm currently streaming from. I am joined by an incredible group of panelists today. Thank you all so much for being here. We will also be joined a little bit late by our final panelist, hopefully. As I introduce each of you, I would also love for you to tell our audience a little bit about what you do in the tabletop gaming space and also what your favorite piece of horror media is. Movies, books, short stories, podcasts, games, anything like that. Anything even vaguely spooky. Beginning with Raven, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Raven. I am your self-proclaimed chaotic good goth pariah on the dark corners of the internet. I have only just started in the tabletop space, but I've always had a love for horror. Um, Starting with my first love-hate relationship of Chucky, which is something that we may or may not dive into today, but I just genuinely um I enjoy horror because I think it's a really good way to kind of almost like own some of the parts of yourself that you're so afraid to let out. Um, and yeah, my pronouns are they, she. Please use them interchangeably. And I hope to say cool things.
Thank you. Wes, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi there. My name is Wes Franks. My pronouns are he, they. I am the founder and creative director of Carrying Cover Studios that does Twitch streaming, and we also have a YouTube channel. Go subscribe and everything like that. We do a wide range of different types of genres and kind of content, but we have our roots in horror. I love horror. I think horror is very important to just cultural touchstones, media in general. Some of my favorite stuff, including Scream, because its metatextual narrative on the slasher genre is fucking amazing, and also it's so rooted in the 90s that it's great. The Thing is great because of body horror. And folk horror. I like anything that has to do with folk horror. I think there's a lot of connectivity with history and culture and anthropology that has to also deal with horror. And it's a very, very cool way to look at the fringes of what is acceptable society, because typically some of the main characters in horror are going to be people that are considered not of the norm, much like a lot of the people on this panel. So yeah. And you can follow me on Twitter at ThirstTrapMoth. You don't have to, but if you want to see somebody rant about professional wrestling and this other stuff, then come and follow me.
Thank you so much. Jay.
I'm trying to make my camera like frame better and I zoomed in too far. Okay. Hello everybody. My name is Jay or Nala. I use both names. I use they them pronouns, and you can find me on Twitter at NalaWoo and at NalaDraws if you want to see my art. I am a professional illustrator and voice actor, sensitivity reader, cultural consultant, tabletop RPG content creator, and actual play stream performer. Um, I'm very excited to be on this panel today. My perspective is a little bit different from everybody's, given that I don't really engage in horror much at all. But I have realized recently that there are ways that you can do horror taking out everything that I don't like about the genre and have it still feel like horror. And this realization was brought to you by one game of 10 Candles played on Halloween night with my friends. And it made me. It was a lot of fun, and it was like life changing in the sense that this genre that I've avoided pretty much my entire life, I realized that there could be space for me to engage with it, and I'm excited to hopefully find a group of people and a table someday that I can engage more. But thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Puja, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, I am Puja. My pronouns are she, her, and my experience with horror goes back to when I was very young and decided to stay up too late and listen to my brothers and their friends telling scary stories. Immediately scared the living daylights out of me. Could never look at a doll the same way again because of Chucky stories. And like, I don't know, I was just a kid with a big imagination. And so, like, the story of Bloody Mary had me running past the bathroom at night. Like, and it just became one of those things where, like, the only way I could deal with this, like, fear was to delve into it. So I spent a lot of time reading Fear Street books. And so I came through horror through, like, the young adult book sphere, and then, you know, expanded to movies once I moved back to the US. And horror has always been, like, granted, there was never anyone that looked like me or and, you know, was suffering from so I didn't even understand, like, the queer angle of it. But I always identified, and I was always attracted to horror movies where, yes, there's the trope of the final girl, but I always identified with the girl who is surviving, because more often than not, she was a fighter. She defeated whatever it was that was plaguing her or chasing her, and that strength is what drew me to horror. That, like, no matter what came at you, there was a possibility to fight back and win. And so that was my original lens into horror, and why I identified so strongly with horror, because there wasn't a lot of media where you did have strong female figures surviving at the end of the day, even if it was one. And but I'm excited to talk about this from a queer perspective, from the perspective of a minority, because they never survived. Other things, yes, you can find me on Twitter at Puja and at Pujabarwaki, everybody everywhere else. So come follow me.
Thank you so much. Looks like we are joined by our final panelist. Hello, hello. Everything should be set up all right. Ellie, if you would like to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ellie Collins. I'm the storyteller for ATL by Night, a Vampire the Masquerade campaign. I've been in horror for many years, running a horror audio drama called the Blood Crow Stories that does queer-centric horror stories every season. We took a break in the pandemic, but I'm actually getting back to that. But my start in horror is Are You Afraid of the Dark? Which is actually, I wrote a TTRPG that's an homage to Are You Afraid of the Dark, coming out this month, and we're doing a game of it later today with Raven and a few other people. But I've always loved horror, and I like bringing queerness as well as womenness, I guess is a word, into horror, because when we started the Blood Crow Stories, I had a bunch of dude bros in the horror podcasting genre tell me that I had no place there, and I said okay. So I focused on making a very cinematic sound, visceral, terrifying show, and I have rather enjoyed my space in horror.
Amazing. And Sarah, if you'd like to introduce yourself and then talk about your favorite horror media.
Hello, yes, I'm here. My name is Sarah. My pronouns are they, them. My start in horror, you can find me everywhere at Sarah's Coffee, everywhere on the internet. I do a lot of TTRPG things and a lot of actual plays and things like that. Love talking about them. Got my start in horror in my own imagination, where I was scared of everything for many, many, many years. And then something switched in my head, and suddenly I was like, I can watch all horror ever, and just to digest it and sink my teeth into it and love it. And from that moment, something that I really discovered and was entranced by was the idea that horror seemed to be telling stories that nobody else was. And sometimes that meant bad things, sometimes that meant bad movies, sometimes that meant really terrible movies. But at the end of the day, there is a style of tragedy in horror that I think doesn't always exist in many other styles of media that I absolutely adore. And my favorite question that I like to look at in horror is, what is horror? What makes it what classifies horror as horror. My personal definition, very broad, and I will fight to keep that broadness for the rest of my life. But my favorite type of media is a very hard question to answer, but I have to go with I love sitting down with a good horror movie. I love pausing it every 30 minutes to frantically discuss the themes. And one of my favorites is The Descent. You should go watch it. It's great.
Amazing. Well, thank you all for joining me here today. Just to start us off before we get into some questions, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the history of horror and why we're even here. Now, the genre of horror is widely diverse and has a wonderful and rich history, but there are many elements of that history that are not always very positive towards minorities. And I'm being polite, especially representations of things like disability, queerness, and gender racial minorities in horror are often include representation that is violent, that is monstrous, that others and ostracizes those who do not fit the conventions of what is considered white, normal, average, etc. Representations of disability in horror media often exist to contradict a sort of neutral state of a normal body, using physical difference and mutilation to suggest evil, as opposed to a more childlike or virginal or feminine, natural white body state that suggests moral innocence and therefore survivability in horror media. Common tropes include the physically mutilated or twisted monster, which suggests that their appearance is representative of their inclinations. Horror also has a history of racism and xenophobia. Movies like King Kong, images of screaming white folks threatened by a gigantic, monstrous, and othered creature, or endangered white women being threatened by othered folks. Tropes like the person who was first to die in a horror movie always being a queer person or a person of color, and depictions of racialized violence in the history of horror movies. Specifically, the Haze Code, which was put into effect until 1968, was a code set in the standard of the film industry, which required that movies present wholesome and moral storylines, meaning that homosexuality and queerness were banned in any form until 1968 unless they were presented negatively in a movie. This code was also incredibly racist and anti-Black in what it expected to be represented in film. Other films like The Silence of the Lambs, a very well-known horror film that came out in 1991, is a well-known example of a critically acclaimed horror film which gained widespread praise despite its rampant transphobia. So depictions of gender minorities, racialized minorities, and disability in horror films are a huge part of the genre. That being said, the horror genre is also a place where topics are tackled that aren't necessarily represented in other kinds of storylines. Monstrosity, otherness, depictions of things that are not sanitized can often be spaces where people who might not find representation can actually see themselves in those forms of media and reclaim them. And that is why we are here today, because we are talking about horror in the tabletop genre and also reclaiming it based on our own identities. That being said, I am, once again, Alex. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. You can find me everywhere on the internet at Aldermancy, on Twitter at Alder_Mancy. I am a GM of a homebrew horror campaign every single Saturday, and I have recently begun my deep dive into horror media. So I'm very excited to be moderating here today. I'm going to start out with our first question. And if you don't necessarily have an answer for this, if you want to just share your perspective on maybe the reason that you haven't had access to the genre of horror and tabletop gaming, or a reason where you felt ostracized, like you couldn't access this area, love to hear that perspective as well. And we're going to once again begin with Raven, and then I'll go back in a different order with our second question. So Raven, what was your first introduction to the genre of horror in tabletop gaming?
So I am still relatively new to the tabletop space, meaning like I'm still a little baby, right? Under a year. We're close. We're getting there. And I think my first actual experience was a Monster of the Week campaign, or it was a one-shot. It was supposed to be one-shot, turned into a campaign, as most things do, where I created my character Delena, who is the spooky. And it was interesting for me to really start to see myself in this character that I've created, or parts of myself in this character that I've created. Be able to navigate situations in real time with extreme horror elements. So in the one shot, I went to a little town in Alaska searching for somebody with secrets of my own that I wasn't willing to share. And it ended up turning into a way for us to find different clues based off of our abilities that I was crucial in. I wasn't like the co-host or the side piece. Like, I was a main character in that. And I was in love, right? It was just me, a brown, queer, non-gender conforming person speaking truth to a narrative that we have seen so many times with, you know, the cisgender white woman. So it really did open my eyes, and like, I've always had a big imagination, so being able to create that part for myself was really very powerful.
That sounds amazing. Thank you. Wes, what was your introduction to horror in the tabletop genre?
So, technically, it was Werewolf the Apocalypse, LARPing, kind of stuff like that. But like, that's kind of horror, because it can get kind of horrific, but you're kind of the monster in that kind of frame of reference, depending on how it's going, and definitely within that LARP that I played in, it was the flannels and everything. So it was, you know, running around in the woods and playing rock, paper, scissors as a bunch of werewolves. So that was kind of like the first introduction. But like, where I got scared, where I was sitting at a table and I was feeling creeped out because there's candles all over the place, it's Halloween, it's dark, it might be stormy and windy, was the tabletop role-playing game Dread. If the audience does not know what Dread is a tabletop role-playing game that does not use dice, it does not use cards, it does not use chips or tokens, it uses a Jenga tower. There are some popular streams that you can find that were done by Geek and Sundry that have like a full set and everything, but no matter if you have a full set with costumes and music, or it's just you and a bunch of people around a table playing Jenga, but with a horror story, it is terrifying. It is tense, it is terrifying. And I loved it so much that for years on, I ran an annual, like, we did a Samhain, like Dread game, where we would rotate different GMs that would come up with a different story. And it would be, oh, there's a party at a lake. It's a party at a lake, and then there's a slasher thing that happens. Or there's deep monsters, or vampires, or ghosts, or what have you. But that was just, I became so enraptured with it because it was such a unique experience that it just really stuck with me. And I'm still chasing that high of the first one. I'm still chasing after it. I need it. I haven't found anything close yet, but we're gonna get it. But that's me.
Thank you. And Jay, have you played a horror tabletop game?
I have. I've actually played 3. I mentioned 10 Candles. That was the first, like, overwhelmingly positive experience I had. But allow me to travel back in time to college. I believe it was I think it was winter of my freshman year. One of my friends, who is a game designer, and she does like great stuff, she made a game called Plague, and it's a really cool game. I think all y'all would love it. It's not my thing, as I discovered that night. TLDR, I was running a D&D game for evil characters or whatever, and I had a massive panic attack right before running the session for totally unrelated reasons, and We did the entire game session, lights completely out, and I like my head was down on my screen. Like I was just like head down talking like to the table the whole time. Because I wanted to play and I didn't want to not play, even though I probably wasn't in the best headspace for it. But we played the whole game session. It was great. It was 2 a.m, and Church was like, "Can we play test Plague, like right now?" And everyone else was like, "Yeah, sure." And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And so then we jumped right into this playtest of this game, which, like I said, is it was really cool. I don't remember a ton of it because this night was kind of a blur, but long story short, it was not really anyone's fault. I think it was just lack of having a session 0, lack of talking about boundaries, and also Church being an incredibly good horror GM. Like, I got scared so bad, and I had, I think, like, another anxiety attack. And I was like, not gonna do this again. I never want to do this again. This was bad. Like, I am not having fun. That was my first dive into it, and I kind of was just like, no, I don't ever want to do this again. This was bad. But then fall of 2019, I had my second sort of thing. I wasn't a player. I was sort of like a co-GM for a play-by-post horror game called The Depths Above that, if you know Riley Gritch, she was running this game play by post on Discord, and I was roped into playing an NPC for all the players. This game, unfortunately, did not get very far, as games are one to do. But that was like my second, like I had agreed to do that because I was not a player. I would not be experiencing the horror myself. I would be helping to create it with my NPC who was supposed to be the antagonist. And that was a lot of fun, and I wish that could have gone longer. And then the 10 Candles game, which I said already, was a very good experience with those same people from the first experience. But we all talked beforehand, which is very important.
Safety tools.
Safety tools are so important, and I was not like coming down off a panic attack either. And it was just like so. It was very rewarding and very fun, and my character died, and it was sad, but a good kind of sad, like the kind that you finish the story and you're like, yes, this is how it should be, and this was great.
Amazing, thank you. Puja, what about you? How did you get introduced to horror in the tabletop space?
My introduction to horror in the tabletop space came at Gen Con in 2019 because I was trying to play as many games of a type that I had not played before. So it was my first introduction to Powered by the Apocalypse as a system, and other systems as well. But my first game was actually a Bluebeard's Bride game, which I joined because I started off in written RPGs, and so I had done versions of that story in writing, and a friend of mine was GMing Bluebeard's Bride, so I signed up for her game because I knew I'd feel safe exploring feminine horror at a table with the GM that I had known and actually came from the same writing space as I did. And it was, and I think we're probably talk about Bluebeard's Bride later, but it was such a wonderful experience, despite the fact that I had 2 other friends who are both cis men on the panel with me, but they are, very aware of issues and are very compassionate and empathetic players. So anyway, I had a really great time exploring feminine horror, gothic horror in tabletop in a way that felt safe, that felt like reclaiming the narrative, that put me in a seat of power, but also gave me a sense of that we can do whatever it takes to survive, that I love about horror. And the same Gen Con, I also played Zombie World, also in the Magpie Room, which I think at that point was only the card-based game, but that was another, I don't know, people will debate whether or not zombie survival is true horror, but it was so great. And once again, like Raven said, like I was a main part of the story. I wasn't, you know, my character wasn't dismissed out front just because they were queer or a woman or brown. And I had just as many secrets, as many chances to survive, as good a shot at making it through as everybody else on that table. And starting off on that same even footing was just so powerful.
Amazing. Ellie.
For me, first exposure, I was 13 and got invited to a Vampire the Masquerade game. And so it was all the goth kids in school. One of them was in class with me. I had just had an OCD diagnosis and stuff that in retrospect was autism. But got diagnosed and was like, oh, great, I'm crazy. I don't know what to do. And they were like, you want to come play a game with us? You can be a crazy vampire. And they showed me Clan Malkavian and welcomed me in. And I felt okay with my diagnosis and welcomed into a group. And they were very intense. It was a Sabbat series. So I started out playing a Malkavian and Tetribuse Sabbat. But probably outside of that, first big like scared the crap out of me was the Call of Cthulhu Magnus Archives game that we did on Gehenna. That I get the heebie-jeebies thinking about that game still.
Amazing. And Sarah.
I feel like my answer is a little bit of the call is coming from inside the house. Because I was my first introduction to horror in tabletop gaming, completely unintentionally, because I'm always very big on safety tools and things like that. So I've always had my players, whenever I GM or DM, fill out safety sheets. We've done session zeros, etc. And something that I started to find was happening was that people who would play in my games would be like, oh, Sarah's like really good at creating tension. Like if you're going into their game, prepare to be a little spooked. And I was like, a little spooked? Am I creating spooky situations here? And then I would start saying that right up front and be like, hey, is everyone okay with me leaning a little bit into horror? Which led into very fun situations where games that don't typically have horror baked into their system could become things that were horrific. Like, I feel like the funniest example of a slightly horror game that I ran was a game of Mouse Ritter, which is a game about little mice. It was terrifying. It was so scary. And just the agency that I found in that was that I'm sure that many people are familiar with this struggle in the TTRPG industry, that you have to like fight for your place a lot to not be spoken over, talked over, steamrolled at a table. And in horror especially, that can be a really big problem in that sometimes horror is used to punish, you know? DMs who enjoy power trips, to anyone who's like played at gaming stores, things like that, are very familiar with those kinds of DMs. And you do not want to play horror with those DMs. So discovering that I could be the one who took all the safety onto myself, made sure my players were comfortable, and then could create a frightening experience that everyone was like laughing at the end of, was very empowering and very exciting. And that was my introduction. And then I said, let me play. And I got in like 3 other games, but that's for another time.
Fantastic. Thank you all. I'm going to float some questions and just have people kind of hop in and answer them, trying to keep our answers to 1 or 2 minutes since we have about half an hour left on our panel here. So question for the group. Have you, if you feel comfortable sharing, can you describe a moment where you felt alienated from the genre of horror, or like there wasn't a place for you, either at a tabletop table or just in general?
I think I said mine in my intro.
Yeah.
I was always welcomed until I hit podcasting. Podcasting for some reason was the ultimate white cisgender male boy club, and I was not allowed, and so I just made a better show anyway.
Amazing.
I think honestly, like at least the people that I've associated with are pretty welcoming and accepting. There have been a couple of people who have tried to shut me down, but I'm also Petty LaBelle, okay? And I will choose to put petty hair on every single day and not even really like pay attention, or I will clap back the fiercest. So I'm sure that there are more people who do try it. I just don't see it because I don't care to see it. I'm going to have fun with my friends and I'm going to do things that I want to do. And at the end of the day, that's what all of this is about.
Mm-hmm. Please, Jen.
I think one of the biggest things that has prevented me from engaging in horror is the fact that a lot of my lines and veils are big elements of horror that is seen a lot. Like, I really don't like graphic descriptions of gore, body horror, too many bugs, too many holes, like a bunch of stuff that is like cultural touchstones of this genre. I don't like mind control. I don't like, like even like I want to be talked to as a player before you kill my character. It's like stuff like that. And all of these lines and veils that I have made me scared to try to play horror with people because I don't want to feel like I am disappointing people by saying you can't do all these things and then therefore this game will be less than for everyone else who is otherwise okay with those things. And so that's been like a big thing that's been preventing me from like doing horror because I just like don't want to feel like I'm limiting other people. And that's mostly like a me thing. Like I feel like I can find people who are able to engage in stories that are tragedies, as was mentioned earlier, like horror as tragedy, without any of the like shock horror kind of elements that I don't like. And so that's sort of been my thing is I am waiting. I'm waiting to find people who will play with me.
Sarah, please.
I was going to have a different answer, but I kind of want to follow up on Jay's and talk more to that, if that's okay, because I empathize with you so greatly in that situation, and I feel like this is a perfect place for me to talk about Alex's campaign, Strange Hungers, because I am also a person who I had some diagnoses that happened in the time that we were playing the game and made me understand my brain a lot better and made me realize that I had a lot more lines and veils than I thought I did. And we were like 20 episodes into the series. And suddenly I realized that there were things that could make me have a panic attack or go completely nonverbal and be ruined for the rest of the day. And I was so worried because I was like, here I am in this game that I love, and I'm about to come in and ruin it and be like, no, we can't do these things. They're bad. And I am so, so grateful to the people that I play with, to the DM that I have, that we were able to like renegotiate. Just to give an idea of like my lines and veils, I absolutely cannot handle like explicit and described harm to children. I can't handle harm to animals, like not in the space of monstrousness, but definitely in the space of just like regular animals. I also am not great with character death unless it gets discussed beforehand. And I have a plethora of other things that I have lines on. And it's been so healing and wonderful to still create a horror experience that just doesn't touch on those things. And it's really opened my eyes to being like, accessibility in horror does not degrade horror. If anything, it elevates it because it leads to us reaching to higher heights in order to find what is good, what is valuable, and what is frightening. So,
and I just want to say real quick to Jay's thing as well. As a forever GM, I love when people have like intensely detailed lines and veil sheets, because my autistic ass, if people are like, I'm fine with anything, I'm like, now I don't know what to write. Like, I have no idea what to do if I don't have those guidelines and guide rails. So when people have super specific things, I'm like, okay, you have filtered down what I can do. Yay. And so it's actually super exciting when people are willing to share those and willing to give those guide rails, because I can create a better horror experience by having my own structure provided to me by the players.
Amazing. That actually leads into our next question, which is, Methods of creating safe spaces for play can be built into table games, like we've been talking about. Safety tools like X-Card System, Aftercare, or discussing in advance. So I wanted to ask you all, since we've already touched on them a little bit, have any of you used safety tools in a horror game, and have you experienced a moment where they made you feel safer or they created space for you? Puja.
This kind of also ties into what Jay and Sarah were saying. Is part of what I love about horror as a human who looks like me in this world is that horror allows me to be scared while retaining control. I am scared in a limited circumstance, and I know that I'll be fine, which is why I'm the person who goes every year to a haunted house, because I know there are rules. The actors cannot touch me. There will always be a way out. So I know that I can experience the increased adrenaline, the fear, while knowing at the same time always that I am safe. And my experience in tabletop, thankfully, has been very similar, thanks to wonderful GMs like yourself, in that I know that I can say that, hey, I don't want to be scared in a way that can bleed over to phobias that I have myself, that touch too close to real life experiences that aren't horror in a fun way for people, but I can still be scared while knowing all the while at the back of my mind that it will be okay. I can walk away from this game and not have my day ruined, not worry at this table the whole time that something's going to show up and I'm just going to sit there freaking out and not be able to perform the way I would like to perform, or interact with my players and do justice to them and their stories the way I'd like. So yeah, safety tools, lines and veils, which, as Sarah mentioned, can and should be renegotiated as the game changes, because your relationship at the table is going to change over time. Things that you may not have been comfortable exploring, suddenly you're like, you know what, I'm okay with us delving into this because I trust you and I trust this table and I trust us to explore this in a way in which I can pull the parachute out at any time. And so, yeah, I think safety tools have in every way possible enhanced my experience at the table.
Thank you. Raven.
I actually, same Monster of the Week campaign. We were dealing with a character death. It wasn't a permanent death, which was good, right? And it was discussed beforehand. But there were themes within that for me, because I have issues with people discussing personally their near-death experience. It hits a little too close to home for me. I didn't realize that was even an issue until it happened. And so thankfully, we did have tools in place where we cut to break. Because I turned it down initially. I was like, okay, I'm fine. I can handle this. And then I just I waved my hands and I walked away and they just cut. And then we were able to stop and renegotiate. And I was able to ugly cry and sob what I needed to. And that's something that we know we're not going to touch on. So if we didn't have something in place to begin with, a foundation, I wouldn't feel okay in that situation. I probably just wouldn't have come back. So I think it's really important to be overly communicative about these things, because there are themes that can genuinely affect people's day-to-day lives.
Thank you. Next question to throw out to the table. Have you experienced a moment, either in gameplay or within the text and narrative of a game that you were reading, for example, that made you feel safe or allowed you to explore an element of your identity? Have you felt seen or represented in a TTRPG game about horror in a way that you didn't find yourself in another kind of game or another form of media?
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm going to throw out a big example. Recent games that I've played, they're from the Gauntlet. Jason Cordova wrote on them. They're called The Between and Brindlewood Bay. If you do not know what
Brindlewood Bay.
Brindlewood Bay is amazing. If you don't know what Brindlewood Bay is, you play a group of elderly women who are in a book club that solve mysteries, but there is an element beneath the surface of that there is an eldritch cult that is trying to summon an ancient deity from the ocean depths of this bay, and you have to stop that. And so there's a little bit of horror tied into this mystery game.
You've said so many words I love.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
It's
it is.
fantastic.
It's extravagant. And on the other side of that, The Between is a game that they developed that if you're a fan of, let's say, Penny Dreadful or The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, if you like Victorian Gothic horror where it's very, you know, like sexually charged, but there's also a lot of horror involved into it. It's very dramatic. Both of those games, they've developed a whole pre-care, aftercare system for the entire thing. They have it's called Cats. It is fantastic. It utilizes X card, lines and veils, everything. And a lot of games, we're seeing a lot of games recently develop their own forms of such things, or incorporating other different kind of safety tools that have been incorporated into it. But this is like the first like couple of games that I've ever played where it's like explicitly like, hey, this is a horror game. These are the things that come with it. These are the things that you need to talk about. These are things that you need to talk about afterwards, after your sessions and everything like that, so that you can. That's a big thing that like we're starting to see more people like think about, but aftercare was not really touched upon when safety tools were first being developed. But now, as you know, as it happens with everything, the more experience you have, the more development comes with it, and the more fine-tuning happens. And it's so cool to see a game like have a set system within it, built into the system, as well as it is, where it's mechanically incorporated to make sure that people are taken care of. Because shit gets heavy. It gets really heavy, really quickly, and out of nowhere. So having something like that in place, and also it's just really fun, and the artwork's dope, and it's just really cool and stuff. But, you know, as comes to mind immediately.
Amazing. Absolutely. Anyone
Mine
else?
is
Sarah?
quick.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Ellie, and
no,
then
mine's
I'll...
Oh,
just-
Ellie, please.
Opening Vampire the Masquerade and seeing the storyteller referred to as she. Because I had stayed away from D&D because it was nothing but dudes and they were all miserable to be around. And then when I opened Vampire the Masquerade the first time and it was referring to the storyteller as she, I said, this book by default says I can be here. And that made me feel safe.
Amazing.
I love that. So, fun fact about me, when I first started playing D&D and other TTRPGs, I was so deeply in the closet, which I feel like is so many people's experiences, you know, like I didn't know I was queer. I didn't know that I was like gender non-conforming. And I mean that in like the biggest sense of the word. Like those parts were blocked off from myself. And it was only through like TTRPGs that I felt like I could finally start to explore those things, and then exploring them like led to the understanding in my brain. Specifically in horror, I have a very recent story that I love to tell, which it's more of a story of less of an identity and more of a, it made me feel so safe and so seen and understood in who I was and my identity. Is that I was playing a character in a playthrough of Outbreak Undead, an actual play, and before the game one time, my GM sat next to me, and without even making eye contact with me, he was like shuffling his papers, said, "Sarah, there's something that I've realized about you, and it's that you like to be scared." And he was someone that I trusted implicitly. They were a wonderful GM. And so hearing that, I was like, something is planned for me. And that episode, I went into a creepy house all on my own that had like tailored scares to the phobias I had asked to be explored in the game. And it felt so good. And another part of that character that was so lovely was that I had just come out as gender nonconforming right before I started playing that character, or maybe even right after I started playing them. And so she ended up having a name change, even if her pronouns didn't change. And there was a very specific addressing of that in the game, of that the moment it happened, it was very explicitly said that like, everyone adapts to this like they are fish in water, essentially, you know, and that is who you are now. And so the combination of feeling so safe in that horror and feeling so safe in identity was such a beautiful experience.
Thank you. Also touching a little bit on some of these like genre horror games like Bluebeard's Bride, which is a horror game by Magpie Games, which we've already talked about a little bit, allow players to confront the abuse that is directed towards people who might be unlike themselves. For example, in this case, a woman, the bride, who might undergo things like sexual advances, body shame, and emotional manipulation. So I wanted to know, have you guys played any games that created spaces for talking about topics that you might not otherwise approach? Meaning games that delved into either identities you didn't hold or aspects of your identity that you hadn't seen represented in games before, or maybe some darker elements that you wouldn't necessarily talk about in another game unless it was explicitly in the text of the game to negotiate. Raven, please.
Black horror villains done well. Can we just say that? Not like the guy shooting the grocery store, but like actual Black villains done well. I
can't think of any.
Well, then you
Candyman's
needed
all I
to
got.
come to my table,
Yeah.
baby.
Apparently.
So I like, this is the only thing that I will toot my horn a lot. Don't worry about it. But I am a little bit baby GM. I GM'd for the first time last month. And I created a purely like queer, non-gender conforming Black villain. And for me, it was just amazing, right? Because we always see the stereotypes when it comes to people of color or you know, queer people in a villainous role. So to have a character that is poised, bartender, very likable, charismatic, you know, and flip the script, and then to make him human, because the reason why he was doing these things was because he was tired of being suppressed as a person. I just, hands down, one of my favorite moments in my tabletop career, because it really, for me, it was a full circle moment where it's like, okay, I just proved that we can tell Black stories, and we can tell queer Black stories, and we can invite our players to bring their culture into their games with them. And it is not hard, and it is easy to do well if you want to put the time and the effort into it. Okay, listen, but I would marry him, to be honest, too.
I mean, what is a villain if you don't want to marry them a little bit, you know?
No.
And if that isn't the queer experience in a sentence, I don't know what is.
Speaking of queerness and monstrosity and representation in horror that we don't often feel connected to, have there been any moments where you found yourself connecting to elements of a marginalized part of your identity or an identity you didn't have through monstrosity in a tabletop game? Jay, please.
So I've had a I think the word is revelation, listening to y'all talk, because I think I finally found the words to describe the kind of horror that I'm actually interested in. Because I really I don't like the adrenaline. That's the other thing. Like, that's why I don't watch horror movies. This is why, I only made it through season 1 of Stranger Things, because I was like, the plot is good enough for me to keep watching this. And the last episode of season 1, I watched with the volume off, and I was just reading subtitles the whole time. I couldn't do it. I really hate jump scares. That's like the worst part for me. I personally was at the Boston Marathon bombing, so I can't do anything like that, so bad. But hearing you guys talk about all of this, and also the words horror as tragedy earlier, I wrote those down. I think the kind of horror that I'm interested in is more quiet, and the horror that is found in sadness and somber situations and trauma, not active or running away from something that will never stop chasing you or whatever. I think my sweet spot is in this quieter, sadder part of it, and going off the question with like this queer thing, last summer for what like my school doesn't do thesis, but like if I were to have a senior thesis, this would have been my thesis. I wrote a queer tragedy because I had never written tragedy before, but it's something that I was kind of interested in and I wanted to try it. And so I wrote a queer tragedy, did world building and all that stuff for it. And it was one of those things where I was like, I know that my main character is going to die in the end. And I did the character designs and all that, full well knowing that. But I was like, this sort of sadness still feels so incredibly, like, I don't know. I don't see queer love tragedies really, like, at all. And to have these characters who are just like all the like represent different facets of my identities and like all of those things like coming together. I'm, you know, it's religious trauma, like all these other things that I wrote about for this story, all coming together to create this story where my character does die in the end, right? It's like it was nice to write that and to have that sort of cathartic experience of exploring different parts of my person in writing.
Psychological horror is horror. I will defend that until the day I die.
I've
Amazing.
got
Well,
I've got some recommendations for quiet horror if you don't mind. They're very quick.
I will have you send those actually after because we have just 7 minutes left and we do have 7 panelists. So I want to wrap us up with just saying if we could just go around, like you have literally a minute. If you have one piece of advice or one recommendation to share as you just kind of exit and say like who you were, that would be amazing. We're going to go back in reverse order with Sarah.
Oh, okay. I was like, I have so much time. Okay. My one piece of advice with horror that I would give, oh Jesus, I would say don't be afraid to take your time and don't be afraid to pay attention to the little things. I found that it's not very in the way of what Jay was saying. It's not the flashbang in the TTRPG that makes the big effect. It's describing the quiet of the room. It's describing how you can hear the floor creak. It's describing the ambiance and the way that your head is in that moment. So pay attention to those things and you're going to have a real good time. And they're like pretty much safety checklist friendly, you know? It's great.
Thank you. And Ellie.
My advice would be develop nonverbal ways to nope out or check in with players or let players give like a yellow or a red. Because especially for those of us on the spectrum, when shit gets rough, we go nonverbal and we might not have the ability to speak up and say like, hey, can we move on from this? Or we might feel too frozen to move from the table, but we can give you a little this. So develop hand signals with your fellow players.
Thank you. Puja.
This seems obvious based on the conversation we had, but whether it is a one-shot, a charity stream, or a long-form campaign, do not go into a horror game without doing safety tools. If a horror game calls you in and they're like, we're going to get started, and there's no discussion of lines and veils that is respectful, there is, at any point, if you feel like someone's being dismissive, nope out of there. Like, your mental safety is paramount, and if every single person at that table is not coming in with that realization and expectation, just get out of there. There's better tables out there, I promise.
There definitely are. Thank you. And Jay.
Hi, are you like me and you're scared of everything? There is a place for you here too.
Hell yeah.
And if anyone else identifies with anything I've talked about today, I would love to chat with people. One of my wish lists right now, I want to play Vampire the Masquerade so badly. And because I'm in the boat of like, if I play it once, I would love to run it. And when I run this game, it is going to be, I feel like, possibly different than any other Vampire the Masquerade game you will have ever played. And I'm very excited. I want to run it.
I cannot wait to see that. Wes.
Yeah, respect. Respect is paramount when it comes to horror. And that is not just respect for your other players, that is respect for yourself, that is respect for your narrative, and that is respect for the topic. what we've seen, there's been a lot of examples, Alex touched on them before, of non-respect and tropes that are utilized in horror. They're tired, they are not wired, get rid of them. Sensitivity consultation is not expensive. It is very accessible. There are plenty of people that you can find online doing it. You just have to go on Twitter, type in sensitivity consultants, TTRPGs. There's a search bar for a reason. Look it up. I've had to do it for games before. I have games set in the South. It is set on native indigenous land, like most of the land, all of the land here. So don't just get away from those old tired tropes. Respect is the most important thing.
Thank you, Wes. And Raven.
I will say this is a little two-part answer. One, consent should never be implied. Make sure that you are getting explicit consent from your players, from your DM, your GM, because it is a two-way street. And that requires being overly communicative. Even if you feel like you're being a pain, you owe it to yourself to make sure that you're having a safe experience at the table. And two, on a more personal level, like, you're allowed to like things and not like things. You're allowed to do that. You're allowed to have preferences. It's why, you know, we're all queer, right? We have preferences. That's who we are. And I don't think that you're doing yourself any favors by selling yourself short. I say it 1,000,001 times. I know what I bring to the table. I'm not afraid to eat alone. And I think that's really important because there is a table for you somewhere. It might take a little bit to find it, but don't allow yourself to settle for something that you are not fully comfortable with.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for joining me. I'll pop in with my last little thing for the last minute, which is everything that everyone has talked about here, safety tools. I just also want to say horror is inherently political. Talking about violence against marginalized groups actually perpetuates violence against them, even if it's in a form of media. So things like consent, safety tools, and creating stories that show characters who look like you or who look different than you, that is also a form of empowerment. Horror exists and can empower if you do it right and with the right people. Curating your space is a form of protection and, once again, empowerment. Thank you to all my panelists so much for joining me. We have hit our perfect little time, and thank you, Wes, for producing. Go check out more virtual HorrorCon panels, actual plays going on all this weekend. And thank you for watching.